Hi, I'm Stephen Bruce. I run the Academy of Physical Medicine, and here's 45 minutes of free CPD for you. This is just an example of what we do. We run a free session every month, along with 70 plus hours of live learning with others CPD every year. If you'd like to see more, click the link in the info section below the video, and that'll take you through to our website. Enjoy. Well, good afternoon. Here we are with the second broadcast in 2 days. And I have the ever sexy subject of insurance for you. This is, this is a tricky one to cover for reasons you'll be all too familiar with. There are relatively few insurance providers around, and we're never comparing like for like. So simply looking at premiums is only part of the story. Also, and I've seen this with a number of members who've come to me for help and advice recently, most people don't care about their cover until they actually need it. You know, as long as they've got the legal minimum, then they're happy. And I've got a juicy story to illustrate just that in a little while. I suppose I have to begin with a disclaimer. I'm not a financial advisor, and I am probably every bit as confused by insurance as you are. The policy wording seems purposely designed to conceal every salient aspect with jargon, and I'm endlessly suspicious that there'll be a hidden exclusion clause somewhere, which means I can't get any help with what can be an extraordinarily expensive process. And just to illustrate that, if you find yourself up in front of the beak, as it were, a decent barrister could well set you back £50,000 for a week's court appearance. So where do you turn to for insurance advice? After all, insurance reps are a sleazy, untrustworthy species lurking somewhere down there with the used car and double glazing salesman. My guest today is Nick Elwell. Welcome, Nick. You're an insurance rep, I believe.
Thank you for the invitation.
You're actually the managing director of BGI, which is a fairly hefty insurance broker, aren't you? And you are the people that we at APM use and recommend. But as I say, I'm not a financial advisor or anything like that. I don't know, we have had so many questions recently about insurance, and I have promised everybody that this is not a sales pitch for BGI, but I need someone who knows what insurance policies are talking about when they use all those jargon expressions. So we're hoping you can be fairly even-handed about what you say.
Fair enough. I think I make the worst salesman on the planet, so you're fairly safe.
Good. Well, the first thing I wanted to talk about was the whole business of what types of insurance that people might want to take out and what they're obliged to take out. And I've listed a few of them on a slide, which is going to pop up in here in a second. And of course, we are legally obliged, are we not? So let's put that slide up where it is. There it is. So we're legally obliged to have what I call medical malpractice insurance, but which is referred to in the Osteopaths and Chiropractic Acts as professional indemnity insurance. So they must be the same thing.
Yes, no.
Right, okay.
Professional indemnity insurance is much the same as medical malpractice insurance, but generally speaking, the PI cover, professional indemnity insurance, will exclude physical damage or injury.
Okay.
Whilst medical malpractice clearly is designed specifically to include that damage.
So the important thing in here is that if your policy says medical malpractice, it will include professional indemnity.
That is the intention of what the Act says. It just hasn't said it very clearly. Right,
okay. Again, people are going to be wondering, when they see these terms bandied around, they're going to be wondering that they're getting the right policy, clearly. There are other things that we need to think about. I've got several up on this board here. Let's look at public liability and employer's liability first. Are we required to have those separately from our medical malpractice insurance?
Yes, is the obvious answer. Generally speaking, I think that the regulatory material includes public liability as a matter of course, along with professional indemnity. And then employer's liability is a legal requirement with or without being an osteopath.
So you say generally you think, but presumably you can speak definitively about the policies that you offer to practitioners.
We will always give public liability with professional indemnity and also product liability.
Right.
Product liability relates specifically to things you sell or give or treatments you give using a machine or a mechanism of some sort.
Right, okay. I'm pretty confident that all the policies I've looked at, and I've looked, preparing for this show, I've looked at the policies offered by the Institute of Osteopathy, and I use them rather than a broker because theirs is what's called a block scheme, I think, so you can only get it through the IO. I've looked at the policy offered by the British Chiropractic Association, again another one of those block schemes, and I've also looked at Balens, who are independent, and they all cover public liability and product liability, I think, within their policies.
Do. Yeah.
So quite important. Employer's liability, presumably, you only need that if you have staff.
You've got to be careful about the term staff. If you employ someone just for a couple of days and you're instructing them what to do, technically they are an employee.
Well, you'll know that a lot of osteopaths and chiropractors work in group practices where the osteopaths or chiropractors are called associates. They turn up in the principal's building maybe with other people there, maybe not with other people there, but they're not acting under direction. They are simply doing their own thing as medical professionals.
In that circumstance, who would raise the invoice for the work that they were doing?
That's a very good question. So not invoicing the patient, the invoice that the practitioner would raise for their money at the end of the month.
Yeah.
We probably can't answer that question because it will differ across practices.
Absolutely so. So that's what people need to look at to begin with. If you are part of a clinic and people come through the door and you see them as you will, and then you invoice those individuals, then you're not employed. Mm-hmm. But if there's a receptionist and you're working within that, and it's the clinic that invoices for the work done, and then you get paid by the clinic, the chances are you are an employee in the terms of not PAYE, but in the terms of the employment legislation.
Right. God, that further confuses things, and it's probably outside the scope of today's discussion, because as far as have always thought, if you're an employee, then you have to pay, if you're an employer, then you have to pay PAYE national insurance. But there are exceptions.
And absolutely. If you think of labour-only subcontractors, they are, by definition, employees in the eyes of the law.
Right. We won't go down that route because it's going to get very, very complicated.
Indeed.
And,
best thing, if anybody's got any queries or questions, ask when you're asking about insurance.
Okay. That does bring me neatly on to entity insurance, though, which is something which has been brought up by a number of people prior to this show. Entity insurance, as I understand it, is where a client, in our case a patient with an axe to grind, can decide to pursue the owner of the business, technically the business, which is an entity, rather than the person that carried out the treatment.
Indeed, that would be normal. If you go into a clinic and you are treated by a person within that clinic and something goes wrong, but you have been invoiced by the clinic, your contract is with the clinic, not with the person who gave you the treatment. So you will always have your first right of call, if you like, against the clinic.
Right.
And that is the entity. The individual is then the employee or the subcontractor, depending on how the business has been set up. And the world of osteopaths and chiropractors is slightly different because they each individually have to have insurance. Whilst if you just run another business of any sort, you can insure all of your staff under one collective policy.
Right.
Excuse me.
This is more complicated than I expected because let me use my own clinic as an example, and I don't think it's vastly different to a lot of other clinics. A patient comes into the clinic. At the end of their treatment, they're not actually given an invoice. They're presented with a card machine or a click on a button on the clinic software whereby their payment is taken. And they only get an invoice if they ask, or a receipt if they ask for one. I suspect that in the past our receipts have had the clinic name on them, although that will be changing in the future. But if they don't get that, all that's happened is some money has been paid. And at the end of the month, we issue an invoice to our practitioners saying, you owe us this much money for room rent. And by the way, we've now deducted it from the money we took on your behalf. Here's your money back.
More complicated because of the way that it's done, so I wouldn't like to
No, okay.
speak on general terms. We need to look at each case individually.
But that entity insurance is probably a good thing to have if you are running a clinic regardless.
Absolutely. The entity is going to have some form of value to it. It's going to perhaps own the clinic. It may indeed employ other people, such as, I don't know, receptionists and what have you.
Yeah.
They all need employers' liability insurance. And if the clinic owner stipulates when the osteopath or chiropractor can and can't work, they will almost certainly be deemed employees.
Right. Okay. And to be an entity, do you have to be a partnership or a limited company? Or?
No, I mean, as an individual, you are a legal entity.
Yep.
You could be a partnership, and that partnership would be a separate legal entity.
Right.
And you can be a limited liability company, and that again can be separate. So the entity is a legally recognizable body, be it individual or corporate.
Okay. The last thing on this list, which I hadn't covered so far, is legal expenses, because I think that's one of the things that scares people, but it doesn't really scare them until the prospect of a complaint is raised. And I mentioned earlier on, this is very recent, I was speaking to a barrister about a case that he might have taken on, and it was going to cost £50,000 for what would probably have been a week at the Professional Conduct Committee. Which isn't even a proper. It's not a court in the sense that, as you know, they're slightly different. That's an awful lot of money, and perhaps you could talk to us about legal expenses. I imagine that legal expenses is automatically included with policies for practitioners, is it?
No.
Right.
Generally speaking, it's not included. It's normally done by a separate independent organisation. Excuse me.
But if I go to the BCA or to the Institute of Osteopathy or Balin's and say, I'm an osteopath, I want cover, will they not bundle that legal expenses in with the other policy?
They will almost certainly bundle it, but it is a separate policy, a separate contract.
Okay. Right. Do I pay you a separate fee for my legal expenses, or is it all just one bill?
You tend to pay what you're charged, and that will be, it could be 5 or 6 different policies for each of the different sections,
Okay.
Or it could just be one invoice saying this includes.
Right. And are all legal expenses policies equal?
No.
Okay, give us some detail on that then. What should we be looking for?
It's really difficult to tell what people should be looking for, because each person's going to have a different value as to the services they can get. Recently we've changed the one that we do to include complaints. Complaints isn't normally considered a legal issue, it's just an irritation.
Okay.
But we've adopted the principle that if somebody gets a complaint, if you can get a solicitor to send that reply back, even if the solicitor is instructed to send it back in nice, warm, cuddly words, it is still coming from a solicitor, and that will make the complainant think twice about continuing.
Yeah.
If it's a genuine complaint, then it'll go through anyway. So we're not trying to stop complaints. We're just trying to avoid those irritations that aren't really complaints, they're irritations.
Yeah. Interestingly, we did a show quite a few years ago now on the subject of fitness to practice, and we had a whole lot of people on the panel, including the barrister I just mentioned, and possibly on the show or possibly subsequently in a social gathering over beers, he was saying that if insurers employed a legal representative to deal with complaints at an early stage, they would probably save a lot of money in the long term, because they wouldn't be paying for a barrister at £50,000 a week to cover the complaint, because it could be dealt with as you just described.
That's the thought that we're looking at.
Right.
Or we have now put in place. So
okay. I can't expect you to know about other people's policies, but do other insurers do the same thing?
A couple of the other insurers will provide defence costs for industrial tribunals, if you like, or being had up by the General Osteopathic Council or the chiropractic equivalent.
Yeah.
But they don't actually deal with soft complaints.
Soft complaints meaning?
When I came last week, I didn't like the way you treated me, and I'd like my money back, please.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So you're calling that a soft complaint because it's not likely to lead to significant damages of any sort?
Well, initially,
damages. I'm sorry, I should be clear. Neither of the general councils, Osteopathic Council, Chiropractic Council, if you go to either of the professional conduct committees, they can't award damages. They can't make any financial award against you as a registrant. But of course, and we've explored this on many occasions, a complainant might see this as a free way of finding out whether they could get a successful outcome in a civilian or a criminal court. So, yeah, I'm thinking about compensation for the patient rather than money back.
Well, lots of people, unfortunately too many, will just try and get some money back out of the person that they've taken a service from. It's not a real complaint, it's just a try. So if we can persuade people to not continue with that try, then less osteopaths and less chiropractors are going to land up in front of their respective bodies.
Yeah, I've got a bit of paper here, and I didn't bring down all of the policies or anything like that. This one is actually from the Institute of Osteopathy's legal expenses cover, but that doesn't matter because it's pretty much the same you've assured me across the board. But it says, in terms of being awarded legal expenses, your case must have at least a 51% chance of success. If it's 50% or below, then they won't cover you. Which seems to me to be like that get-out clause, because the insurer themselves will determine whether it's going to be successful or not, won't they? And again, that's not a criticism of the IO's policy, because they're all the same, you told me.
They are very similar, and it could be viewed as a get-out clause, but on the other hand, if every event that went to the lawyers was taken on, all of the lost causes would just push everybody else's premiums up by enormous amounts. Yes. And so you have to draw a line somewhere. Okay. The idea of being 50%, I think, is rational, but very often the 50% can be shifted a little bit, because if you're trying to defend a claim where someone's after you for £1 million, and you know that you're not going to win it, then perhaps if you were looking at a lower number, then the chances would change, and so your 50% odds would alter also.
Indeed, but equally, if you were an osteopath or a chiropractor facing the Professional Conduct Committee, and instead of being struck off the register, you were merely suspended, you would possibly regard that as a success.
I would agree, but that's, I would say, where most of the policy wordings are slightly weak, and you then depend on your broker to have that conversation on your behalf.
So what do you do in those circumstances at BGI?
We've never had anybody in a situation where they're going to be struck off, but we have had situations where we've changed the goalpost a little bit so that we fit within the parameters of the policy as it's written.
Right. Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to a separate slide here. I've got this particular issue, which is about legal expenses. We've had a question from Martin who says, can we choose any lawyer to represent under your policy? He's talking about yours at BGI, or does it need to be one you recommend? Now, the reason I put this up is because same barrister, Jonathan Goldring, who I have an enormous respect for and who you and I both know well, has pointed out to me that under the insurance company's legal expense insurance regulations 1990, the insured has the right to direct who they have represent them at a hearing. However, some policies are written in a way that gets around that.
They are indeed. Again, what the insurers are trying to do is limit their exposure rather than not pay claims. And I think that's an important thing to understand. The way that our policy does it is to pay a limited percentage of the individual's choice of barrister. So I think it's 40% currently. Sometimes it can be more than that if going to that barrister might actually produce a better result than going elsewhere.
So if I want to use a barrister and it costs £50,000 a week, I'm going to be paying a significant proportion of those fees?
You will indeed.
Right, okay. And if I don't choose my own barrister?
Then all of the fees are paid in accordance with the policy terms.
Okay. That's probably as much as saying, no, you can't pick your own legal representative, isn't it? Because no one's going to be able to say, well, all right, I'll pick up the £30,000 of these fees.
It depends really on the nature of the claim. I think it's one of those things where the insurers cannot promise everything all the time because the clients wouldn't want to pay the premiums.
Yeah.
And therefore they have to draw a line.
Yeah.
And different insurers will draw that line in slightly different ways.
And you were saying, as we were talking over coffee earlier, that you only need a couple of claims of 50,000, 60,000 or more to whack everybody's premiums up in a small market like osteopathy and chiropractic.
Well, indeed, if there are 1,000 osteopaths and they each paid £10 a year for their legal expenses, that wouldn't cover one significant claim.
Yeah, yeah. And it probably it probably accounts for the reason that chiropractic insurance fees are so much higher than osteopaths. I don't think they're any worse practitioners than osteopaths, but of course they had that big string of complaints a few years ago from the, largely provoked by the Good Thinking organisation, whatever they're called, society, which I think led to quite a few payouts.
It created havoc for a little while in the UK market, even worse in the Irish market, but it didn't spread quite so badly to the rest of Europe.
Right, okay. Paul says, I'm a director and employee of my own company. If I have BGI insurance with entity, do I need insurance in my personal name? Does the GOSC require individual insurance? Which I think you answered a moment ago.
My understanding is that to be a member of the GOSC, you need to have insurance in your own name.
Yes.
So that there is no benefit in doing anything else. The way that we get around that, and I think we're slightly different to most of the others, is that we will do a policy in the joint name of you and your business so that you have the cover you need, but then we can also provide contingent cover on all the other people who work for you to make sure that you're covered for claims made against you for accidents or incidents that they're responsible for.
Right, okay. Yes, Paul hasn't explained whether he's the sole employee of his company, has he? I guess if you're in a company, it must be 2 employees, but the other one may not be
you can be a one-man band and an unlimited company, that's fine.
Right, okay. Martin's followed up with his question saying, how do the insurers decide which lawyers they recommend for defending?
All of the insurers have got legal firms on hand, if you like, and they've agreed special rates with them. And those rates are notionally discounted for the amount of work they give through.
Right.
So what we tend to look at is the quality of the firm rather than the amount that they might or might not pay. That's a deal between them. We don't have any knowledge or control over it.
Right. Who do you use?
Currently the firm that we use is Kennedy's, who are a fairly well-known London firm.
And do they specialise in medical malpractice?
They specialise in all manner of things. So they have a marine department, a medical department, you name it, and they seem to have it.
Okay. Do you think that's... Obviously, you're going to be biased towards saying that BGI have got it right. Do you think it's important that someone looking for insurance needs to assess the quality of the legal firm which is used by that insurer for their legal expenses?
I think it would be valuable to do so. In reality, I doubt very much that anybody would, because they rely on the broker to do that for them.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, the chap that I was talking about earlier on in my introduction, I know that he was quite unhappy when he got his legal advice. Because he found that actually he felt that the lawyers didn't specialise in medical malpractice at all, that their biggest business was elsewhere. And I don't know the size of the firm, and I don't want to give away who the firm is, because that then makes this sound a little bit less of a fair hearing, as it were. Yeah. But yeah, he was able to find out who the lawyers were, and was very unhappy with the advice he was offered. Possibly he wasn't getting the advice he wanted. I'm not sure. That's again it's a possibility.
That's a fair point too, because everybody's always right until they're proven wrong.
Indeed. Dom says, do you think we're adequately insured for any pre-investigating committee advice? And could we be insured for judicial review of the GOSC? I don't know what he means by that. I think he probably means hearings at the PCC, which of course is separate from the General Osteopathic Council. So pre-investigating committee advice. Have we covered that already? just to refresh people's minds about this, a complaint comes in, it goes to a screener at the General Osteopathic Council, not at the GCC. If it's got some credibility to it, it will go to the investigating committee, who will decide whether it is something which falls within their remit, and if it does, it'll go to the professional conduct committee to then hear the case. So up until the point where the investigating committee make a decision, the osteopath doesn't get involved, or the chiropractor doesn't get involved that much, other than to provide basic information. How much do we need? Are we insured properly for it? Could we be better insured for it?
I suppose the answer is yes, you can always be better insured for things, because you never know what's going to come out of the woodwork that hasn't been seen before.
Yeah.
And that's part of the trick, is to try and second guess what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah.
Again, the policy that we've pulled out, by including complaints, we hope to get over some of the gap between a formal complaint actually being registered and the irritation factor of it making its way down that line. Excuse me, it's fairly limited insofar as I think the total we'll pay during that period is only £1,800. And because we don't want every person to just do it all the time, there's a 20% co-insurance.
Mm-hmm.
So effectively it means that if there is a £100 claim, you'd have to pay £20 towards the 80 that the insurers would pay.
Right. Which, I guess, if you're the person who's in the position of needing it, will sound a bit unnecessary. But of course, as you said earlier on, it's the only way that you and other insurers, excuse me if I use the term insurers to cover brokers as well, but it's the only way that you can keep the premiums down, isn't it? By trying to minimise the extent to which policies are.
What we like to do, and I can speak, I think, for the entire insurance industry here, not just ourselves, is look after people who've got valid claims. And what we would like to avoid is those where we have frivolous claims. And so this is one way of getting rid of some of those frivolous claims. The reason that we introduced it was that we thought some of the complaints that were being made weren't being dealt with soon enough on a commercial basis. So we wanted to get a lawyer in front of the clients so that they could see that there was a professional response coming out, and they were then not tempted to push their luck by just taking it on to the Osteopathic Council or the Chiropractic Council, whatever it might be.
Yeah, yeah. Simon made a very valid point here a little while ago. He says it's worth pointing out that many malpractice issues, he thinks about 70%, go to the legal stage because of lack of communication. For example, an osteopath doesn't return calls or reply to letters from the complainant. And I think it applies to the chiropractic world as well. And it's far better to avoid these complaints completely than have to draw on your insurance, isn't it? But the bulk of them are the bulk of them are down to poor communication in one form or another.
Well, absolutely. I guess we could go down the line of providing advice on what to do with individual letters that come through. But until we know enough about what does come through, send them through and we'll get them off to the lawyer, and then they can give us the advice on it.
Right.
And if it costs them £80 to send out a letter and you have to pay £20 towards it, it's got to be good advice and good experience, because you'll know for next time.
Everyone that I have spoken to who has been through the complaints process has said what an unbelievable strain it is. Yeah. I think I'm the only person who's had a complaint against them, which went as far as the investigating committee, and I didn't really care because, not that I didn't care, sorry, I didn't feel under any stress, but I actively wanted it to go to the professional conduct committee because I wanted to bring the issues out into the open. But I don't depend for my living on my title as an osteopath, so if they had struck me off, it didn't matter. But for everybody else, it does matter.
Absolutely.
Now, I'm going to bring up that interesting case that I mentioned earlier on in more detail. I've promised that I'll try not to give away anything that would reveal who the registrant is. But the registrant treated a friend a year or so ago. The friend was insured through Bupa and submitted invoices to Bupa. And Bupa then sent a copy of what had been submitted to the registrant, asking him to confirm that it was correct, which he did. It turned out that not only had the patient claimed for 18 treatments rather than 8 treatments. They'd also inflated the cost from £40 to £55. Bupa, of course, quite rightly said, right, we want to see the patient's notes, but they'd also checked and they knew that the price being claimed was wrong because they'd checked with the clinic itself through the receptionist and through the website, which puts the registrant in a very difficult position. Bupa made a complaint to the General Counsel about this. So the reason I'm bringing it up here is because I'm wondering what support that registrant will get from their insurer in a situation like that.
I very much doubt that he would get very much support at all, because criminal actions, and this is what it would be just that. So a claim would be made where the charge was made against it. The insurers would look at the likelihood of it being successfully defended, and we're talking about the claim itself being proven right or wrong rather than any consequences.
Right.
Then they would say, well, if you were aiding and abetting someone steal money, why would you expect us to insure you?
Yes.
I don't think it would be reasonable for all of the other osteopathic members to pay their premiums to help keep effectively a felon. He probably didn't think of it that way at the time, but that's what he is, out of prison.
Yeah.
I don't suppose he'll go to prison for it, but in reality, if it was serious enough, that would be the option. And that really isn't what insurance is for.
No, and we are talking in this case about a few hundreds of quid in the case of the registrant. But the person committing the fraud itself was actually also claiming tens of thousands of pounds on a separate medical thing, and is clearly trying to defraud Bupa.
Yeah.
I suppose for me the success for that particular registrant would be whether he was struck off or whether he was simply suspended. I can't see any other possible outcome from the hearing than those two things. He is, by his own admission and by the facts, clearly he has done what they have claimed he's done. So he's basically going to have to defend himself.
I don't think most insurers, in fact, I go so far as saying I don't think any insurers would be happy in a defence being offered when he'd basically already admitted that it had gone wrong and it was his fault. He made a mistake.
And we talked about sexual misconduct before we came on air, and you had something to say about that. There was a case which I became aware of some years ago where an osteopath had been filming himself having sex with patients in his treatment room. So you might want to talk about a wider spectrum of possibilities than that, but that again would suggest to me that the insurer would say there is no possibility of you defending this successfully given the evidence, so we aren't insuring you for the proceedings.
Well, again, that would be a criminal act, I fancy.
Yes.
And the insurance is designed for civil action, not for criminal action. There is an element of criminal action covered within the legal expenses sections of most policies, and that will offer some help, but as soon as you turn around and say, well, actually, I'm guilty, it's really difficult to know what the insurers could do.
Yes. Yeah. I'm not sure he ever admitted he was guilty until he was found guilty, but the evidence was clearly there.
Yeah. Well, the legal expenses insurers, I think, would have kicked in to begin with and started defending. But then the defence as well as the prosecution both have to look at all the details. Yeah. And when it had become very clear that it was pure, it would be theft, fraud, any other number of things, and what they actually hang it on doesn't really matter.
Take something simpler. You're fond of bra straps, I believe.
Bra straps are quite interesting. Again, I won't mention names, but it's quite difficult for a person sometimes to defend actions because they have no means of defending it rather than because they're guilty of the charge. Yeah. In the particular case that we had is one where a person went in to have effectively a massage on her back. That involved undoing the bra strap. She went in for a second time, she went in for a third time. On the third time she complained that he didn't ask permission to
And I think this
undo.
was an osteopath, wasn't it?
It was an osteopath, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the way we looked at that is that it wasn't what he was doing, it was the charge, it's whether or not he was following procedures. And so we moved it away from being a sexual offence into being a procedural offence, and that we could defend.
Right. Okay. We're getting on in time and we've still got loads of questions. Jules has asked whether you need to be a paid member of APM to have access to BGI's insurance. Jules, no, you don't have to be a paid member of APM to get access to BGI, but you get a slightly lower premium if you are a member of APM, and you also get the wonderful support for people like me that being a member of APM brings, together with over 70 out. That's enough of my sales pitch for APM. I hope people know us well enough to know that we're a fairly well-meaning and good quality organisation. Right, yes, this was something which I wanted to look at as well. We've been asked what the hell is the difference between claims made and claims occurring and this business of run-off cover. And I apologise to people, you're going to have to sit and listen very closely to this because it's confusing terminology.
Most medical malpractice type insurance policies will be written on what's called a run-off basis. That is to say, every time you buy insurance, you are buying it for claims arising during the current year, irrespective of when those events may have happened. A claims made policy is more like your home insurance, that if you found that there was something that happened to your home 5 years ago, you would then claim against the policy that you had 5 years ago,
Right.
not the policy you've got now.
Right. So claims made means that the policy you had 5 years ago will cover you for claims that made now about something that happened then. Claims occurring means that any claim happening now will be dealt with by the policy you have now.
Completely the other way around.
The other way around. I told you it was confusing. You managed to we talked about this before and you managed to confuse me again. Right, okay.
Okay, so
does it matter though? To somebody taking out a policy, surely what we need to know is we're covered, and they all cover us, won't they?
you need to make sure the broker is aware of what you had before so that he can build into the policy that he's giving you the cover that you need now,
Right.
and covering back if it needs to cover back,
Yeah.
and covering forwards if it needs to cover forwards.
Okay. I've seen a question here from somebody who apologised for being late, but said since they are employed in a practice, do they need to have their own policy? That the law says, the Chiropractic Act, the Osteopathy Act says that the individual must have personal indemnity insurance, doesn't it?
It does.
Which is, in
Well,
other words,
we can't get around that. All we would recommend is that the employing company make sure they have contingent cover in case the individual's cover doesn't respond to a claim for any reason.
Right. Darcy wants to know if specialist advice from, say, a psychiatrist acting on behalf of an osteopath is also covered by our standard osteopathic insurance. A lot of osteopaths on this call.
The advice given by the psychiatrist or third party, whoever it might be, if that was part of the treatment, it would be covered under the terms of the policy. However, that person would most likely have their own insurance, and if he was clearly responsible for the claim that was being made, then the insurance would have the right to go back against his insurance for the error that he made during that treatment.
Gosh, we are seriously running out of time. So I wanted to address the stuff that's on the screen here. I had a lady emailing me really cross about the fact that you, BGI, were saying that she had to tell you if she had any elite athletes on her books. But I've looked at the other policies, and that's not unusual that you'd want to know if any of their clients were high earner, Premier League football players, for example, where a week off work is worth several million quid.
Exactly so. Currently the premiums for osteopaths are £350, whatever it is, and that's based on a general client base of people who walk in off the street.
Yeah.
If you specialise in treating football players that earn £1 million a week, you are putting yourself in a situation where any claim made against you for not doing it right will be millions rather than thousands.
Yes.
So yes, we ask that question.
Right, and I would imagine that most other insurance policies will need to know that, wouldn't they?
I would have thought all, but I can't
Yes.
obviously speak
Okay,
for the
fine.
internal rumblings of the others.
Cover for adjunctive therapies is quite important here, because by adjunctive therapies I mean people who do dry needling, who do ultrasound, electrotherapy, shockwave therapy, maybe they do hypnotherapy within their own practice, but it's not their core business of osteopathy or chiropractic.
That's I say we, all of the different insurers treat this slightly differently. Our perspective is that if you are an osteopath or a chiropractor, then if you are trained to do anything, including all of those adjunctive therapies, within your practice, providing you've been trained to do it, you're insured to do it.
Right. Okay. I think when I've looked at the BCA's policy, and people need to be very sure that they are insured if they're doing these things. I think the BCA's policy, possibly the IO's policy, I'm not sure, says that, for example, dry needling, where you've had some problems recently, they don't accept weekend courses, but anything longer than that they will accept.
All of the requirements differ quite markedly, so do take care and basically ask to read the policy before you buy it.
Yeah.
I think that we're the only people who will give you everything that you need, because it's all covered under the chiropractic thing, but you need to tell us what you're doing if it's outside of that. So for example, if you're a medical, or we call it the medical osteopath, who might do being spinal injections or something like that, there is a higher rate for that because it's a higher risk.
Right. Okay. And I mentioned, I said you had problems with dry needling. You've had some claims arising from dry needling recently because of punctured lungs, I think.
Indeed. That's the one area where probably the other insurers have pushed their prices up because of events similar to that.
Yeah. I was quite impressed when I asked you about this after we ran some courses here in dry needling. You didn't want to see the qualifications of the instructors. You said as long as they are respected people who know their stuff, then you're happy to accept that.
Well, the way that we write insurance generally is on, I suppose the principle of insurance is utmost good faith. So if the client tells us, if our insured person tells us that he's had the right training for doing it, then we will take his word for it. If they're an osteopath, they have to go through certain hoops to be an osteopath anyway. And we only say that you have to have the training appropriate to the service that you're providing your clients.
Yeah. And I guess, and I raised this with you at the time, I guess if you have gone on a 3-day dry needling course, such as the ones we run here, and you decide to do a technique which wasn't taught in those 3 days, which we can easily show from the course records, then you wouldn't be covered for that. You've got to be honest about.
Well, indeed, the insurance would have the right to share the cost of the claim with you, might be a nice way of putting it.
Right.
And it depends on how much of that treatment was relevant and how far down the line you'd gone. I don't want to draw a black and white wine. Black and white
wine?
The idea
Yes,
of that.
Yeah.
Because it's one of those, if people look after themselves, if they train themselves properly, then we respect their judgment as to what that is, and we will look after them accordingly.
Tax investigations, we've had a few questions about that as well.
That's included, I think, without exception, within all legal expenses insurance.
Right, which means what? I can't imagine what the expenses in that are. Surely you just give them your books from zero or whatever it is and let them get on with it.
People make mistakes because the law changes, and sometimes they declare the wrong figures because of that. If there's an error made somewhere, the legal expenses will help cover that. Sometimes the authorities get it wrong, and so they'll come after you, and then you'd like a bit of legal help to defend them.
Okay. Yeah.
So.
All right. And I've put in here Good Samaritan as well, not least because we do run first aid training courses here, and everybody's worried about what will happen if you go and do first aid on somebody as an osteopath or a chiropractor and they don't survive or whatever.
We automatically include Good Samaritan cover. We do for any groups that we insure, really, because if you're walking down the road and you see someone keel over, you've got two choices. You either go and help them or you don't.
Yes.
And we don't want the thought of not having insurance being the reason for not saving their life.
Do you know if that's the case with other providers? Because I don't.
I know that one does, and I know that one doesn't.
Which one does?
I'm not allowed to say. That would be unfair.
Okay, so check your own insurance policy would be the answer on that one. Scotty says, what about treating abroad? What about treating abroad? I've previously been to less developed countries, including India, to provide osteopathic care for free. How is that covered? Do BGI cover that?
BGI is exceptional in that, insofar as we will cover you anywhere on the world that you go to, except America and Canada.
I wonder why that is.
Well, the interesting thing you've got to bear in mind is that we can insure you when you go to some places, China, India, for example. We may not be able to actually appoint lawyers to defend you in the event of there being a claim there. So it's a different process of dealing with it, but we will pick up the charges anyway.
Right. Okay. Well, that's quite encouraging. And Dom says, is there any mechanism insurance has set up to reduce the number of PCC hearings that happen due to osteopaths or chiropractors lapsing cover with no malicious intent for short periods? Now, this has come up several times, and you and I have had dealings over this, and I know one of the people who's been on the question list already has had an issue with this. We're talking here about people who fail to see the reminders from the insurance company saying your policy has lapsed, and therefore go for some months without insurance cover, and either realise themselves or are sent something from the General Counsel saying, please show us evidence of your insurance. Because strangely, the General Counsel seem to know when you haven't got it.
I know that some of the market will not assist in any way whatsoever. We do what we can to assist. Technically, if you don't have insurance and you're an osteopath or a chiropractor, then you are breaking the law. So you've got to bear that in mind. The first line of fault is yourselves for not following the regulations that you've approved and agreed to.
Yeah.
But we will help where we can.
Okay. And I fell foul of this myself once. At the time I was insured with Balan's, and I realised, I wasn't asked about it by anyone else, that I had not had my insurance, and they simply backdated my insurance with the proviso that there had been no claims that I knew about in that period at the time.
That would be a quite reasonable way of doing things.
Yeah, but I also know that you have done the same for another practitioner. I think it was an osteopath, when I think Balan's refused in that case to do it. So it's maybe it's a case-by-case basis.
I think it wasn't Balan's, to be fair. I think it was another firm.
Right.
But yeah, it is a case-by-case logic.
Yeah, but what you said is important, isn't it? You are breaking the law if you are not insured as an individual and you hold yourself out to be an osteopath. Or well, if you're registered as an osteopath.
If you're registered and you don't have insurance, you are in breach of their regulations.
The General Counsel seem to be, they understand, provided you can get that backdated cover. They don't pursue this down the Professional Conduct Committee route necessarily. And they also have an abbreviated process for dealing with issues where a registrant hasn't got insurance. Certainly at the GOSC, they now have, I think, what's called a Section 7 method of dealing with it, whereby as long as you admit that it's happened and they say we're going to admonish you, there's no hearing, so you get an admonishment, which is next to nothing, and the whole process goes away. What else have I got on my list of questions? Well, what else have we got here? I was going to look at, again, I only looked at 4 different policies here, listed in alphabetical order, which is Balan's, the BCA, BGI and IO. And the reason I'm putting premiums up on the board here is because I said earlier on that premiums aren't everything. Now, you can see that I am struck by the difference in the fee for chiropractors between Balan's, the BCA, and your own fee, which is getting on for half the cost. The BCA, I've put an asterisk next to that one because you have to also pay their £600 a year membership fee. So there is more to it than that. What is it, do you think, that you are getting if you pay £1,000 for your cover that you're not getting for £683 if you're a chiropractor? To
be honest, the wording is the wording. You're getting the same as everybody else. And it's just the perception from the underwriters as to the risk that they're carrying.
But you are offering 683. Your underwriters are different to theirs, I guess. I mean, the immediate. It's like when you go and buy something online, isn't it? You don't pick the expensive one or the cheap one. You go for the middle one. But you are way below the premium for the chiropractors. Are you cutting something out?
I'll quite happily increase it if everybody would like us to. Our claims experience on the chiropractic side does not genuinely does not warrant charging the higher premiums.
No, okay. If you're a McTimoney chiropractor, it's clearly worth you being insured through Baylands, which is what the MCC, the McTimoney Chiropractic Association will offer, because it's only 180 quid. But interestingly, if you are a McTimoney chiropractor who practices diversified techniques, actually BGI have got a lower premium.
Yes, I think we were competing on that last year, and we were slightly less expensive than our friends at Baylands, and they reduced their rates fairly significantly to make sure they kept that business, which is fair enough. All is fair in love and war.
So I put that up for people's, I don't know, out of interest, if they want to compare premiums. But as you say, they've got to look at the policies themselves to make their own decision on what suits their purposes. We're out of time, and I've got a whole load of other questions here. If I find ones that need your advice, can I send them on to you after the show?
Yes, Nick? Of course.
Well, I hope you've enjoyed that. That flashed past. I mean, I'm astonished. How can you make insurance interesting for 50 minutes? And it has been interesting. Thank you for your time.